where will you find resilience? REdeploy.
So we've been talking a lot about when things go wrong. I mean, we all love a good war story to talk about, but I'm going to focus a little bit on how it happens before then, when we approach overload. And I realize we are approaching overload because lunch is coming, so I'll try to be as brief as possible. So, please read the thesis. Thank you. It's been free time. But apparently I have to actually talk. So I'll introduce myself first. I'm a cognitive systems engineer. That's a discussion for another time if you have questions on it. But I'm a member of the Snafu Catcher Consortium. So this really deals with tons of different snafus. And that's really what I want to focus on during this talk. And give you a chance for 3 different types of takeaways. The first is that there are 4 main types of responses to overload. Next one is that automation acts like we do, in one way. I'm not claiming it's a resilient agent. It's not. But we want to try and reframe the way that we talk about it. And the third takeaway is that, obviously, automation is a black box. It's very difficult to see and to know how to deal with it. So, trying to generate ideas about how we can actually build our systems more resiliently, more intelligently, to actually work with us. So the way the talk's going to go is that 3 sections. I'm going to try and get on the same page. Granted, we've had a lot of amazing talks already describing some things, so I can breeze through a few topics. Trying to go through a short case study, so the walkthrough, and then finishing up with some ideas and challenges for moving forward. So what do we mean by resilience? Well, of course, we've seen this before, the 4 different types of uses or definitions from the Dave Wood's paper. And I'm going to focus on those last 2, the graceful extensibility and the sustained adaptability. So thinking about how we adapt, how we're poised to adapt, how we anticipate bottlenecks and changes are coming. So all these types of things are really going to be important when we think about this complex system. And then the question is, what's the system? It's all of you guys. It's everything that you guys do. And some of you may recognize this diagram from the Stellar report. Good paper, go read it later. There's a couple different sections to it. There's above the line and below the line. And the line of representation is the screens. These are the representations that we've been talking about. There's nothing physical about our software systems. So everything is moderated by these representations. But above the line, we have all this cognitive work. And that's what I'm going to focus on first, since that is very much more familiar to us, since that's the things that you all do every day. So why resilience in software? I mean, you guys are snafu catchers. You guys do anomaly response daily. And anomaly response is, in a formal setting, this model, where you recognize, you detect that there's a problem, some unexpected result. You diagnose it, you try to figure out what's going on, and then you plan and replan to actually make it better. And so there's 5 different areas, a part of this type of anomaly response model that I want to highlight in some of my research that I've done. We have hypothesis generation. So this is the if this, then that. Trying to think of these even soft theories about how you explain when something's going wrong. Next one, the anomalies. The signs, the signals that things are going wrong, that things are degrading or acting weirdly. This one, questions. So one of the other talks mentioned that questioning actually can be a sign of expertise, that it is a sign of uncertainty, where you recognize you are approaching the limits of your own model, that you don't know what's going to happen next, and that's a good thing to bring up to other people, to try and repair some of those gaps. Then we have interventions. So these can be 2 different types. Diagnostic, meaning that you're trying to seek information to prove or disprove theories, or therapeutic, meaning that you're just trying to keep it afloat. And then the last one is model updating. So this is part of that questioning, that you are sharing information, a lot of times during the event, not just in the post-mortem, trying to get people to understand and update where those gaps are in their models. So this is why we really love looking at complex software systems, because it has these three different benefits to actually studying it. We have multiple distributed parties, tons of people with lots of expertise, distributed sometimes globally, but always connected through chat logs, meaning that there's a great evidence trail to be able to try and trace what people were thinking and what people were sharing during an incident. Then we have the highly autonomous networks, where things are going on below the surface, that there are primitive event captures, meaning sometimes the error messages are just, hey, this went wrong. Not much information, but still, it can build up to larger conclusions. And then lastly, theoretically, all data is available. Since this is a purely digital system, in theory, everything can be pulled. Everything is logged in some way. Maybe you don't store it or save it, but in theory, everything should be available. So that's all focusing on the cognitive side, why we think above the line is so important. Well, what about below the line? I mentioned that you have highly autonomous networks, highly autonomous processes. What is that doing below the line? So we got to talk about automation. I don't know why you're laughing. I mean, we live in a world with semi-autonomous networks all the time. I mean, you guys work with daemons, team structures, all these different types of things, but granted, we're not to this point yet. So I'm going to talk about what we're actually dealing with at the moment. So in the recent past, AI, ML, all these different types of technologies have been around for a long time. And so some studies have been done on how people react to automation in the cockpit, how they react to medical devices, such as infusion pumps, that are very difficult to actually see inside. Nowadays, we have things like I mentioned before. We have teams, we have load balancers that dynamically distribute load without human intervention. In the future, well, hopefully we have some highly intelligent assistants. Maybe some self-driving cars, but that'll be ways into the future. The way I like to think about it is this, that these types of automated processes that we have are pseudo-cognitive agents. They're a type of responder. They're not perfect. They're nothing like us fully in terms of we have very complex models that can change our assumptions, but we do have a few things in common, like similar challenges to coordination. Some are unique to automation, but it also responds to saturation or the risk of saturation in a similar way, because that's how we build it. So I gotta explain what saturation is. In another word, it's overload. So it's thinking about how there's a dynamic capability for adaptation that gets exhausted over time. When there's more dynamic load being pushed onto it, it can lead to the system to fully break down. Another way of showing this is that it's like a sponge. It soaks up so much pressure, so much load, that at some point it cannot handle anything more. And so that's when we get full overload. And breakdowns can really be beneficial in some ways to recognizing those gaps in our model. Let's talk about those 4 responses I mentioned. So the first one, shedding load. So for people, this can be something simple as pushing off work. Okay, so I have this assignment I have to do, well, I'm just not going to do it. Not advisable as a career move, but you can definitely do that. We have reducing thoroughness. So this can be something like just getting things done more quickly, doing it less exactly, less thoroughly, trying to get it done faster. I mentioned the efficiency thoroughness trade-off. That is one response to that. The next one is recruiting resources. So this is a little bit more strategic. The first two are much more tactical, meaning an immediate response. The more strategic one is recruiting resources, asking for help, asking for expertise to come on board. And then the last one is shifting work and time. So if you can't get to something right now, you can move that deadline to a time when you are better suited to actually deal with it. So these are the 4 different types of generic responses that Woods and Hallnagel laid out in the Joint Cognitive Systems book that almost every cognitive agent does. So what about automation? I'll save that for a little later, since let's talk about an example to try and get at that idea. So, not a live demo, thank goodness, but I do want a little bit of participation here. And I will prime it with a few things to think about. So we've been talking about hypotheses, talking about anomalies, and talking about interventions that can be done. So I want to draw from your own experience, because I'm going to give you a very generic setting for this walkthrough. But it's going to be up to you to fill in some of those gaps. So we also have to think about how does that fit with the 4 responses. So the setup is that you are whatever your role is, from an e-commerce website. You have lots of traffic, lots of customers daily. So you are now called to come into an incident in the middle of the night. Meaning you don't have much to go on, but hopefully, because you are such a wonderfully great incident commander, you are going to take charge and make good decisions. So the case starts that you walk on the scene, there are 2 groups in the chats. There's one group that's been focusing on memcache issue. So memcache server is doing something funny. The reporting server is also doing something funny. And we've got 2 distinct groups that are both trying to mitigate the problems. So I'm going to give you some of these options for what hypotheses that you will come to the table with. So these could be separate issues. The memcache issue could be totally separate from the reporting server issue. Have very little in common, nothing directly linked. You could have one where it's the memcache server is actually impacting the reporting server. And then the vice versa route. And the last option is that there's something else connecting the 2. So these are really the 4 types of options that you have. And of course, the last one can break down into lots of other areas. But this generically are the 4 options available to you. I want you to keep that in mind. Just a quick show of hands, how many people do deal with any sort of caching servers and reporting servers daily? Okay, so you guys have good experience. So let's start out with the first stage. Okay, so this is a little bit of what we know. Not much. As I said, information's coming in. There was a recent code push. Don't really know what the scope is or what was going on, but there was a recent push. Okay, got that. A few people are saying the reporting server is down, that nothing's getting into it. The queue to try and get in is fully loaded. But then we also have some people focusing on the memcache issue, that they cannot connect to the servers at all. So also presumably that is overloaded too. So I want to see a show of hands, just as a preliminary idea, who thinks that they are separate issues? Might be getting too much of a complex system here. Alright, so who thinks it's memcache? Who thinks that's probably the issue? Okay, got good hands. What about reporting server? And who thinks it's something else? Okay, I see, yeah. We have a few complex folks there, so if we're thinking about someone else, okay, as the incident commander, might direct to look in other places. So might want to ask some people to look around, find other connection points between these 2, since there might be something connecting those. All right, we got some more information. There's been the recent change. It seems like it's a likely factor in this problem because there was actually a change to the reporting server. There was something that was impacting it. we're still in the same state that the reporting server is down, but the engineer who made that change has now reverted it. So that change is now going back. We're still in the problem state and memcache is still down, but luckily our site is still operational, so nothing's really terrible yet. All right, so now we're going to see, have ideas changed? Hands up for separate issues. For memcache reporting. How about reporting to memcache? And now let's think about the last one. See, a lot of people have changed their minds onto that one. So the final bit of information I'll give you is that the reverted change has helped. So apparently, the reporting server seems to have calmed itself down, it's no longer being overloaded, and we're finally getting things through. However, something weird has been noted that usually we mark on the graph when a push was actually sent out, but it's missing on there. Well, I guess that kind of makes sense if the reporting server is down. So that goes in line with our model. And we've now realized that memcache was nearing its capacity limit for open connections. So more so than usual, maybe we already were at like 80%, but now it's getting higher. So it's starting to slowly go down now too. So, quick show of hands, anyone for the first three? Or the last one? So before I reveal what actually happened, I want you to reflect a little bit on that. Since I was trying to draw forth your own knowledge of your caching systems and your reporting servers, think about what assumptions you were making, what limitations or incidents that you were bringing to bear that informed your decision on something. Granted, it was a short, fast exercise, but the way that your environment has shaped you really influences your decisions in these moments. And of course, what responses might you consider? Especially going forward and thinking about how we actually deal with these anomalies. So, what actually happened in this case? Well, you guys were not exactly right. The real cause, or contributing factors really in this case, was that there was a motivation to change some of the reporting dashboards. One of them needed a different type of granularity for the data, and so it needed more data to be served at a certain time. The engineer that pushed the change was actually the main trigger for this incident because he was unaware that there was actually a method to try and get into the reporting server. It was a filtration method. It aggregated and sampled from all the different clicks and other information that was coming in to the reporting server, which was very critical because he had it on the home page for whenever it loaded, it would send a message to the reporting server directly. And that's why it basically blew up. Meanwhile, while the home page is waiting to hear back from the reporting server, we have this problem that it's stuck in a waiting position. It has told memcache to open a connection, but given it no direction. So now we're in a state that memcache keeps opening these open, idle connections to the point that it's almost maxing out its number of connections. So they weren't even doing anything, but they were just waiting to the point that they were getting saturated in a different way. So I'm going to show you a different representation of this case that I did for my master's thesis work. This very complex diagram is showing a tracing of the hypothesis, the collective hypothesis space that I traced through the chat logs in the case study. And I say collective because this is from Slack logs. In a collective shared space, in theory, all this information, all the signs, signals, interventions, questions that people are bringing up is technically available. So this could potentially have been on people's minds. So one of the things to note in this space is that there are multiple paths that combined in the end to see this unifying picture. That because the reporting server was posed, now it's holding up memcache in an idle position and maxing it out. But initially, we had two divergent paths that eventually came together because these two disparate groups thought they were separate issues initially. And it's very hard to see below the surface to tell if there was a different originating contributing factor to that. And I do note, start and end, it's very hard to say when an event truly starts and when it truly ends. But that's for another discussion. So we'll go back to the ideas of the four types of responses to overload. So I color-coded them just for sake of reference, because I charted them both above and below the line for this case. Because we can see, in the first one, above the line, this is what people were doing at the time. And you'll notice that it's a lot more towards the blues and the greens, the strategic responses, where they were recruiting resources, asking for help, but they were also trying to shift work in time, thinking about holding off new changes, trying to maintain order, but also thinking about ways how we can spin up new boxes, how we can extend that capability when we might need it next. Versus automation. So this was the below the line processes that were going on. And a lot of it was, implied in the chat logs that there were tons of dropped connections. That was apparent from the reporting server not being able to keep up. Then also reducing thoroughness. So we often see this in terms of latency, that the system was degrading to a point it could not keep up with the demands. And you'll notice that it's mostly those upper two, more so than the strategic ones, because automation tends to be very brittle. It's not very good at adapting. So I'm not saying it's very resilient, but it does respond in a similar fashion to the way that we do, because ultimately we programmed that. It also did have a few interesting things that it was trying to recruit resources in a sense. It was trying to open new connections to try and alleviate some of those load. So it had a few things that were actually helpful in the long run. But sadly, it was not the best responder. So let's revisit the models that we're talking about. So I mentioned before that these are the four types of responses based off of some examples done by us, done by people. For automation, we can think about it in the same way. Shedding load, examples dropped requests. Reducing thoroughness, the increased latency or degraded performance that we've seen. Then we have recruiting resources. So this can be think as opening up new boxes, having that limit set in a way that you can dynamically increase the number of boxes in you. Kitchen's had a great example in one of his cases about opening up new boxes, new capacity and resources that became available. And then lastly, shifting work in time. I think this one's really interesting for software because a lot of what goes on software is asynchronous threading. And that is literally shifting it to a different timeline in a sense, that it's doing something on its own. And you can also think of it in terms of timeouts and retries. When something is timed out, it pushes that to a future state where maybe it can actually work. That's where the retry comes in. So even these small little built-in mechanisms actually give you different types of responses, a diversity of responses to overload. So I'll remind you again about this above and below the line model, that we're very good at focusing on that cognitive work side, but we haven't talked as much on the below the line side in past research. So I'll preface to you that the below the line is a lot of autonomous network of processes, services that are trying to actively control the risk of saturation. And that one of the difficulties is that there's so many hidden interconnections that it makes it difficult to actually work with when you're trying to treat it as if it's another responder. So what do we do about it? Well, famous paper, talking about how to make automation a team player, 10 ways. These are only a few of them. So it's just reading the paper because it's a great short read. Yeah, there's lots of papers. So, I did 2 years of this, so what do you expect? But, so, observability, directability, and and predictability are some of the key components. It's very well known that black box automation is a black box. You can't see into it. And yet, can you see into someone else's brain? I'd say not. We're not mind readers. And so it's a similar challenge to coordination that we're trying our best to infer intent from these automated processes, trying to understand a little bit more about how they see the world to align our vision of how we see their vision of the world. And so we also need to be mutually predictable. If you have a good model of how these things work, then you can reasonably predict how they might actually respond. And then of course, goal negotiation is such a key aspect of joint cognitive systems. It's so difficult to just work with someone that's not willing to also prioritize their own needs, because their job is just as important in some ways as yours in different aspects at different times. And there's always trade-offs to be had. So eventually, I think automation will be able to talk in those that at least help in some of those negotiations. But of course, there are challenges. Automation is not very clear about what it's doing. I think some people mentioned before about strange loops. So this is when a component's function is somehow actually related upon its own working. And it creates this very strange pattern, almost a feedback loop. So we also have masking, where one issue is covering up or concealing what's actually happening on a different level. Concurrent issues, that's what we had in the case walkthrough. We had multiple things going on. The problem is that multiple things happening at once, we tend to try and connect them in our minds that they must be related. They happened at the same time. But that's just a coincidence of time. It's not clear that things underneath the hood are connected, but they can also be very much connected without you even knowing. And of course, measure limitations. I mentioned earlier that we have very primitive event captures, that a flag was thrown or an arrow was thrown. These don't give a lot of information about what's actually going on or where the problems might be in a larger sense. And so it's very difficult to actually tell where to look next. And the burden is all on you guys as the human responders to actually integrate that information together. So trying to get outside of some of these challenges, I'd say we might need to look at a different perspective. Sometimes it's difficult to see what's right around the corner if you don't even have eyes over there. Or your model is such that if I walk past this box, there's going to be no one right next to it. As most stealth video games would say. So I'm posing a couple of different design questions, because you all are designers. You create code. You create this system. It is a built system. So you are designing it in the way that you think is going to be best. So there's different types of ways that I think we can build these systems to be a little bit more resilient, a little bit more helpful and clear. So one of them is tracking hypotheses. That chart right there is not easy to make, especially in real time. Trying to keep up with a lot of these different types of hypotheses that are thrown around, these ideas, explanations, in the course of an event is difficult, especially when we have just scrolling text logs. So we need to think about other ways to try and capture that information dynamically to make sense and help people get on board when they have to be thrown into a situation. And as I mentioned, how can we get different perspectives on the same phenomenon? See this problem, I think Ronnie had a great example of having, in our chat, having too many sensors doing the same thing on scuba tanks. If one breaks, the others will break in the same way. That's not very resilient. That's not very helpful. And redundancy by itself does not imply resilience, but thinking about it more as a functional sense, where you can look at it from different angles that are not necessarily dependent upon the same phenomena to break down, can give you different viewpoints on how you're actually able to see whatever it is you're trying to look at. And lastly, thinking about these joint cognitive systems, how can we make our system more observable? How can we work with it as a team player? Because it's not just a bunch of tooling, a bunch of things that we've thrown together to make our goals work. This stuff does run on its own in many ways. It will not continue to run on its own because it is often brittle to the challenges of a changing world. But it does things without our direct intervention. So I would think that at least any managers in the room would probably want an eye on that. So I'll reiterate my takeaways for this. That there are these 4 different types of responses: shedding load, reducing thoroughness, recruiting resources, and shifting work and time, that are a general way for you to think about how you and your systems are responding to the threat of overload. That automation does respond in similar ways. Caveat that it doesn't respond very well, but it does do some similar patterns. And of course, it's difficult to see. Like any difficult system to coordinate, you have to try to find ways to make it more observable, more directable, and hopefully more predictable. So since we've talked enough about my thesis, there is a tiny URL for it. It's only a short novel, not that bad. The Stellar report is also a great one that we produced from the Sanford Fisher Consortium that gives a good overview of a lot of these different concepts in a shortened version. So I'll leave you with a bunch of references. Thank you very much.